David Harper bolted upright in bed, his heart pounding against his chest. The shrill ring of the phone pierced through the silence of the night, dragging him from a restless sleep. His room was the alarm clock. Who could be calling at this hour? Rubbing his eyes, David fumbled for the phone on his nightstand, dread already curling in the pit of his stomach. In his years as a single father, the night always held the worst kind of surprises. "Mr. Harper." The voice on the other end was calm but firm, with the unmistakable tone of authority. "This is Detective Hall from the Denver Police Department. We need to speak with you immediately." David's pulse quickened, the fatigue of his sleepless nights washed away in an instant. "What's going on? Is everything all right?" Was the kind that made anticipation an incident. "We found a woman, Sarah Matthews, dead at her residence tonight. We need you to come down to the station." Sarah. The name, a bell-tolling disaster. Seen her in days, though her presence in his life still lingered in the space between him and his son. She was Ethan's teacher, a close friend, perhaps more than that. And now, she was gone. David felt the room tilt slightly as he sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing with possibilities. How could this have happened? The police called him. The crack, already widening after the collapse, seemed to grow darker, and Ethan, his 12-year-old son, had been acting distant, withdrawn. Was it because of Sarah? Something else lurking beneath the surface, a problem he had yet to grasp. David ran his hand through his hair, his mind struggling to process the news. "I'll be right," his voice barely steady. Up. He sat in silence for a moment longer, the weight of the situation pressing down on his shoulders. In 2020, suburban neighborhood of Cherry, Colorado, felt like the tree-lined streets and well-manicured lawns painted a picture of upper-middle-class stability. A community where careers thrived and families seemingly flourished. But beneath that facade, tensions brewed in the hearts of its residents, especially in the Harper household. It was a place where secrets festered in the cracks of modern life, a place that, until now, had known little crime. At the center of this growing storm was David Harper, a 45-year-old architect who had built his life meticulously, brick by brick. David's home, line and perfect symmetry, mirrored his profession, not his personal life. For just over a year, David found himself struggling with the weight of being a single father to his 12-year-old son, Ethan. Though his work continued to provide financial stability, the emotional toll of raising a child alone began to wear on him. The house felt emptier without the presence of his ex-wife, and his relationship with Ethan, once strong, had grown distant. Ethan, once an energetic boy, now spent most of his time locked away in his room, a shadow of the child David once knew. David, despite his best intentions, often felt helpless to bridge the gap. It was in this vacuum of connection that Sarah Matthews entered. A 30-year school. Did herself as the solution relationship with his son. Had been hired as a tutor to help Ethan with his studies, but her presence in the Harper home quickly extended beyond that. Sarah was charming, attentive, and most importantly, she seemed to get through to Ethan in a way David hadn't been able to in months. But under Sarah harbored with her blonde hair, sharp wit, and a knack for reading people. She knew exactly how to manipulate those around her, to her advantage. She had come from a modest background, and the thought of climbing the social ladder through David's wealth and influence was too tempting to ignore. David, affection, didn't. To him, Sarah was a breath of fresh air in his stifling, isolated life. She listened to his worries about Ethan, offered comfort when he spoke of his failed marriage, and, soon enough, their late-night conversations turned into something more. But as much as David wanted to believe in this newfound connection, there was a part of him that remained uneasy. He was aware of the growing distance between himself and his son, but was blinded by his need for companionship. In Sarah, he saw hope, a potential future where he wasn't alone. Yet, beneath the surface, his choices were creating a dangerous ripple effect, one that he couldn't yet foresee. Watching from the sidelines, Michael Harper, David's 70-year-old father and a retired police officer, wasn't as easily fooled. Years on the force had honed his instincts, and something about Sarah didn't sit right with him from the beginning. Michael had always been protective of his son, and his suspicions grew the more he observed Sarah's subtle manipulation. She was too smooth, too perfect. Michael noticed the way she positioned herself in conversations, always making David feel like she was the only one who truly understood him. And while David into her grasp, and to uncover the truth, just fatherly concern that fueled Michael's suspicions. His years in law enforcement had taught him that people like Sarah often had hidden motives. Her need to be personal affairs, it all. Despite his warnings to David, the architect dismissed his father's concerns, chalking them up to paranoia. But Michael knew better. Quietly digging into Sarah's past, trying to piece together what she was hiding. As the weeks passed, the dynamics between the characters became increasingly fraught. David's growing him at odds with his father. Caught in the middle, withdrew. He didn't understand the full extent of the changes happening around him, but he felt the tension, felt the shift in his father's attention, and the invisible wall that was building between them. Each character were becoming clear were the fractures in their relationships. Seeking solace from his failed marriage and the pressure of single parenthood, allowed himself to fall under Sarah's spell. Sarah saw David as a mediocre existence, the social ladder, and Michael, seasoned and suspicious, saw danger lurking behind every interaction. Determined to protect his son from a mistake that could ruin his life. Little did any of them know, the decisions they made in the coming days would unravel all their lives in ways none of them could predict. Sarah, seemingly benign, that ignited a fire. Sarah's visits to David's house had started innocently, enough professional. Even she would arrive after school hours, books in hand, to tutor Ethan in the quiet confines of the living room. Ethan, though resistant at first, seemed to improve academically under her guidance. But as the weeks passed, her presence in the house began to change. What had once been structured tutoring sessions turned into casual dinners, with Sarah lingering after lessons to chat with David over a glass of wine. Conversations that had started with Ethan's progress in school soon drifted into more personal territory. David's failed marriage, his struggles as a single father, and the growing distance between him and his son. Sarah, with her calming voice and perceptive eyes, always knew just the right thing to say. David found himself confiding in her more than he had with anyone since the divorce. And Sarah was smiling, always understanding, knew when to listen and when to subtly suggest solutions, drawing David further into her orbit. The boundaries between their professional relationship and something more personal blurred with each passing day. At first, it was subtle. A brush of her hand against his when she passed him a glass, a lingering gaze, held a moment too long. David noticed, of course. He welcomed the attention. It had been so long since anyone had looked at him like that. What harm could there be in letting things slip just a little? But Michael Harper was not blind to what was happening. His police officer had sharpened, and from the moment Sarah began spending more, he sensed something off. Spoke to David. The way she inserted herself into their lives, there was a manipulation there, subtle but dangerous. He warned David more than once. She's not son. Michael in the kitchen doorway after. She's playing you. Bristled at the accusation. He couldn't understand why his father was so determined to see the worst in Sarah. He'd snapped back. Not everyone's a criminal, Dad. She's just helping Ethan. And me. The words left his mouth. David could feel the unease building inside him. His father's suspicions gnawed at him, but he pushed them aside. Sarah was good for him, wasn't she? She was the first person who had made him feel alive again, after the crushing weight of the divorce. Meanwhile, Ethan had begun to withdraw. The boy who had once looked up to his father with admiration now seemed distant, barely speaking during their rare moments together. David chalked it up to growing pains, the kind all 12-year-olds went through. But Michael knew better. Silence was more than teenage angst. The boy had noticed Sarah's influence too. Michael could see it in the way Ethan avoided her gaze, the way he tensed up whenever she was in the room. And Sarah, sensing the shift in the household, became bolder. She demanded more of David's attention, pulling him away from his responsibilities as a father. Her conversations with him turned from comforting to insistent. "You need to choose, David," she said one night, as they stood in the dimly lit hallway. Her voice a quiet whisper, thick with tension. "You can't keep letting your father and Ethan come between us. Don't let them guilt you into staying in that empty shell of a life." The pressure was mounting. David found himself torn between the woman who made him feel wanted again, and the family he was slowly losing. Every warning from plea from Ethan. But Sarah's hold on him. He wanted to believe in her, in the possibility of a fresh start. But the tighter she held on to him, the more suffocated he began to feel. Michael, unwilling to sit idly by, took matters into his own hands. He began following Sarah discreetly, using old investigative tricks he'd learned on the force. What he uncovered disturbed him. Sarah had secrets, and they ran deep. Financial troubles. Questionable relationships from her past. It all pointed to a woman who was far more dangerous than she let on. When Michael confronted her, Sarah didn't flinch. Instead, she turned the tables, threatening to expose him for invading her privacy. "If you tell David what you've found," she hissed, her eyes cold, "I'll make sure he hates you for it. He'll never speak to you or Ethan again." David, caught in the middle, was now faced with an impossible choice: protect his family and risk losing Sarah, or succumb to her manipulations and sever the last fragile ties he had left with his. The tension was building, and something David could feel it was about to break. The night was quiet, with only the faint hum of crickets filling the air as a late autumn breeze swept through the darkened streets of Denver's Cherry. Inside her modest but well-kept home, Sarah Matthews lay motionless, the dim light from a flickering lamp casting long shadows over her lifeless body. Her once warm and inviting presence had been replaced with a cold, eerie stillness that hung heavy in the air. The signs of foul play were clear: her lips, tinged with the faint color of blood, a deep bruise forming around her neck, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle marked by the overturned furniture and broken glass scattered across the floor. It was David Harper who found her, or so the police would later say. When they arrived, he stood outside, near the front steps of Sarah's house, pale and trembling, his clothes disheveled and stained with suspicious marks. His eyes were wild, darting from the house to the officers, as though he couldn't fully comprehend what had happened. I didn't do this," he muttered repeatedly, his voice barely above a whisper. But the scene told a different story. The police, skeptical of his denial, noticed the streaks of dirt on his sleeves and small cuts on his hands. Signs that perhaps David had been involved in something more than he was willing to admit. Inside the house, the detectives moved methodically, sweeping through the cluttered living room as they pieced together the tragic event that had unfolded hours before. Among the mess, they discovered a suicide note left on the coffee table, its words hastily scrawled across a crumpled sheet of paper. The note hinted at despair, regret, and a forbidden love affair, a relationship Sarah had shared with David. It painted a picture of a woman caught in a moral crisis, unable to see a way forward. The words, "I can't do this anymore," etched in heavy strokes. The police, while troubled by the note, were not so quick to close the case as a simple suicide. Something about the scene didn't add up. There were too many inconsistencies. There's signs of a struggle, the positioning of Sarah's body, and the missing pieces of the puzzle that David's shaky testimony couldn't fill. And then there was Michael Harper, David's father, whose fingerprints were found on an item in Sarah's home, an old coffee mug that appeared out of place in the chaos of the crime scene. David, though still dazed and confused, firmly denied any involvement in Sarah's death. "I wasn't there when it happened," he insisted. "I just found her like that. She was already gone." But his explanation did little to sway the detectives. Security footage from a camera across the street had captured David entering Sarah's home earlier that night. Witnesses from nearby houses reported hearing raised voices, though no one could say for sure what the argument had been about. As the pieces of the puzzle slowly fell into place, it became harder to believe in David's innocence. The marks on his clothes, the damning footage, and the troubling note all painted him as a man caught in the throes of a doomed affair, one that may have spiraled out of control, leading to Sarah's untimely death. And with Michael's fingerprints lingering in the background, the case had taken on a complexity that neither the police nor David himself could have predicted. Was it a lover's quarrel turned fatal? Or was there something more sinister lurking beneath the surface? The detectives knew they had only just begun to scratch the surface of a mystery that would unravel in ways no one could have foreseen. The morning after Sarah's death, the quiet neighborhood of Cherry Creek buzzed with the low hum of police radios and murmured conversations. David Harper stood at the edge of his driveway, numb and dazed as the officers moved in and out of Sarah's house, now taped off as an active crime scene. His mind spun with a dizzying mixture of disbelief and fear, trying to piece together the fragments of the previous night. The detectives were thorough, asking the same questions over and over. Where had he been? What was his relationship with Sarah? Why had he shown up at her house so late? Despite his insistent claims of innocence, the circumstantial evidence was damning. His relationship with Sarah was well known, especially now that the suicide note had surfaced, hinting at a scandalous affair. The police were growing suspicious, and their once professional demeanor began to harden. David, they believed, was the prime suspect. The note, his presence at the scene, and his increasingly erratic behavior painted him as a man teetering on the edge. The evidence might not have been clear-cut, but it was enough to justify their suspicion. David's father, Michael Harper, a seasoned ex-cop, watched from the sidelines, his expression unreadable. Michael had been through enough investigations in his lifetime to know how the process worked. He could see the detective's strategy unfolding before him, and it unsettled him more than he let on. Inside, Michael wrestled with a flood of conflicting emotions. On the one hand, he knew David wasn't a killer. But on the other, he feared what else might come to light if the investigation dug too deeply. Michael remained outwardly calm, but inside, he was calculating, silently deciding what truths to share and what to keep hidden. Michael had his own secrets, his own reasons for keeping certain pieces of Sarah's life in the shadows. He knew more about Sarah than David did about her past, her connections, and the motives that might have led her down a dark path. But revealing this information would only complicate things further. And Michael wasn't willing to throw his son to the wolves. He had already interfered more than once, and he couldn't allow the full extent of his involvement to surface. So, he kept quiet, offering the detectives just enough cooperation to avoid suspicion, but never too much. Meanwhile, the pressure was building inside the Harper household. Ethan, who had once idolized his father, withdrew even further into his shell. The boy, already fragile from the breakdown of his parents' marriage, now faced the unthinkable family crumbling around him. His father implicated in a murder, and a growing sense of abandonment. The stress took its toll. Ethan stopped going to school, his once lively demeanor now replaced by long hours spent locked in his room, staring blankly at the walls. His silence was deafening, and David, already consumed by guilt and confusion, found himself increasingly distant from so desperately to protect. Days dragged on, the cracks in their once stable family widened. David, isolated by the investigation, struggled to maintain any semblance of normalcy. Every conversation with the police seemed to pull him deeper into the web of suspicion, while Michael, with his years of experience in law enforcement, tried to keep control of the situation from behind the scenes. But even Michael couldn't prevent the inevitable. The truth was out there, waiting to be uncovered, and it was only a matter of time before the investigators found it. Tensions fled. Michael's refusal to share everything he knew began to weigh heavily on him, and David's increasing desperation made him more volatile. As the investigation intensified, so did the cracks in their already fragile family unit. What had once been hidden was slowly rising to the surface, and the full extent of Sarah's secret life and its connection to the Harpers was about to explode in ways none of them could foresee. As the investigation into Sarah's death deepened, the detectives unearthed a hidden side of her life that no one, least of all David, had seen coming. It started with a series of encrypted emails found on her laptop, each one linking her to a web of fraudulent financial activities. The further the investigators dug, the more they realized that Sarah had been involved in a large-scale financial scam, siphoning money from unsuspecting clients through a shell company. What seemed like a simple affair between Sarah and David was now tainted by her entanglements with dangerous individuals who had been closing in on her for months. The police soon discovered that Sarah hadn't just been manipulating David to secure her social standing. She had been running from something far worse. The threats she had received from her former accomplices had escalated. They wanted their money, and Sarah had been desperate. As the evidence piled up, it became clear that Sarah's affair with David wasn't just about emotional fulfillment or financial gain. It was a calculated escape plan. But it hadn't worked. The mounting pressure from both her personal and criminal life had led her to the brink, and her death was no longer viewed as a tragic accident or suicide. It was clear now that Sarah had been running out of options, and someone had caught up with her on that fateful night. David, reeling from the revelations, could barely process what he was hearing. Michael sat silent but composed, his face a mask of controlled emotion. David's mind raced, filled with questions he couldn't bring himself to ask. How could he have been so blind? How had everything spiraled so far beyond his control? But when the words finally came, they were barely a whisper. You knew, didn't you? About Sarah. You knew all along. Michael didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, and after a long pause, he nodded. I knew she was in trouble, he admitted, his voice low and calm. I knew what she was running from. But I didn't think it would come to this. I thought I could protect you. David's anger flared, his disbelief quickly morphing into rage. Protect me. You didn't tell me anything. You let me walk straight into this. His voice cracked under the weight of the betrayal. The truth was out now, raw and unfiltered, and it cut deeper than any lie. Michael's eyes darkened, his calm demeanor finally showing signs of strain. I didn't have a choice, David. She was dangerous. I confronted her, tried to scare her off. But it backfired. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I never thought. He stopped short, his voice trailing off, as he realized the enormity of his confession. David stared at him, a hollow emptiness spreading through his chest. You threatened her, he whispered, the words heavy with realization. Michael's silence was confirmation enough. In that moment, David understood. His father, the man who had spent his life upholding the law, had played a part in Sarah's death. It hadn't been the underworld that had driven her to flee. That night it had been Michael's warning. His attempt to protect his son that had pushed her over the edge. And now, they were both left to reckon with the consequences of their actions. The forensic team arrived at the scene just as the morning light began to filter through the windows of Sarah Matthews' home. The house, still eerily quiet from the night before, now buzzed with methodical activity. Technicians in white suits moved carefully, analyzing every corner, dusting for fingerprints, and collecting blood samples from the disarray of broken furniture. Underneath the overturned coffee table, they found a trail of blood leading towards the door, too much for it to be Sarah's alone. There was another presence here, a third party whose role in the night's events was now a central mystery. Forensic scientists worked quickly, using advanced blood spatter analysis to determine the trajectory of the drops, and lifting partial fingerprints from a shattered vase near Sarah's body. The prints belonged to Michael Harper, which only deepened the puzzle. But it was the DNA swabbed from a glass on the dining table that raised even more questions. It didn't match Sarah or anyone in her immediate circle who had been with her that night. The scene painted a grim picture, not just of a fatal confrontation, but of someone else's silent involvement. As the investigation moved forward, detectives pulled the security footage from neighborhood cameras, sweeping the area for any sign of suspicious activity. Hours of footage revealed little until one key moment. 6 p.m. A shadowy car was captured speeding down the street, its headlights flashing briefly in the direction of Sarah, peering into the night. The plates were too blurred to make out, and no one in the neighborhood could recall seeing the car earlier. But the fact that it had been spotted leaving the area moments after Sarah's death was enough to give the police a lead. Who was in that car, and what had their role been in the unfolding chaos? As the forensic evidence slowly built a case, the deeper investigation into Sarah's past revealed layers of deceit and danger no one had anticipated. Sarah's life, once seemingly simple and connected only to her relationship with David, now unraveled into something far darker. Police uncovered links to a financial crime syndicate, an organization known for laundering money through legitimate-looking businesses, with Sarah acting as one of their key players. She had been embezzling funds from clients and rerouting them through offshore accounts, a scheme that had gone unnoticed until recently. It was then that detectives found a critical piece of evidence. Sarah's phone, recovered from her bedroom, still unlocked. In it, the last message she received sent shivers through the investigative team. Unknown number, sent at 9:03 p.m., the night of her death. Asterisk, your time is up. We're coming for you. The message was short, blunt, and menacing. It was clear that Sarah had been in serious trouble, and whoever had sent that message had the motive and, perhaps, the means to ensure she wouldn't escape. But the investigation hit its first major roadblock when Michael Harper, ever the strategist, began to manipulate the investigation behind the scenes. Leveraging his experience as a former police officer, Michael discreetly tried to steer the focus away from David. He made subtle suggestions during questioning, deflecting the detectives' attention towards Sarah's criminal associates and hinting at her double life. Michael's calm demeanor and logical insights made it difficult for the police to push too hard on David, even though he remained a person of interest. Despite Michael's interference, the investigation took another turn when a key witness came forward, an anonymous informant, who claimed to have seen a man leaving Sarah's house on the night of the murder. The witness was willing to testify and had even provided a vague description of the suspect. But before they could be formally questioned, the witness was silenced. Their apartment was broken into, and they vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but an overturned chair and a few scattered papers. The police were left scrambling, trying to figure out who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and how deep this conspiracy ran. With every new revelation, the case became increasingly complex. Sarah's life wasn't just intertwined with David's. It was connected to an underworld of financial crime and hidden threats. The police now had to navigate a tangled web of motives, suspects, and deceit. What had begun as a simple investigation into a tragic death had morphed into a high-stakes mystery involving dangerous criminals, a powerful family, and a dark secret that could unravel everything. The trial of David Harper unfolded in the packed courtroom, tension thick in the air, as the prosecution laid out their case with clinical precision. The prosecutor, a sharp-eyed woman with a commanding presence, opened by painting a damning picture of David's relationship with Sarah Matthews. This was no innocent friendship, she began, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. This was a man, emotionally unstable after a bitter divorce, drawn into a secretive and inappropriate affair with his son's teacher. And when that affair began to spiral out of control, it ended in murder. She emphasized every word, her gaze shifting to the jury, each syllable carefully crafted to make David appear both desperate and dangerous. The prosecution focused heavily on the forensic evidence, especially the blood found at the scene and the damning fingerprints that placed David in Sarah's house on the night of her death. They called upon witness neighbors who had heard raised voices and seen David's car parked outside Sarah's house. Their testimonies created a timeline that made it hard for David to explain away. "You were there, Mr. Harper," the prosecutor pressed during his cross-examination. "Isn't it true, you had an argument with Ms. Matthews that night?" David, struggling to keep his composure, denied the accusations but could feel the weight of their case closing in on him. Every glance at the jury, every piece of evidence displayed on the screen, made it clear that his presence at the scene was undeniable. When the defense took the stand, David's lawyer was calm but forceful, determined to shift the narrative. He argued that the prosecution had conveniently ignored the bigger picture, that Sarah was not just a victim of an ill-fated affair, but had been entangled in a dangerous web of criminal activity. Sarah Matthews was running from people who wanted her dead. The defense attorney argued, producing the evidence of the threatening messages Sarah had received from members of a powerful criminal organization. The defense brought forward forensic experts who testified that the DNA evidence at the scene didn't exclusively match David's, and pointed to the possibility of a third-party involvement. "This is not the story of a lover's quarrel turned violent," he insisted. "This is the story of a woman whose life was in danger long before David Harper ever walked into her house that night." The pivotal moment came when Michael Harper, David's father, took the stand. His testimony was a double-edged sword, meant to defend his son while revealing the painful truth that Michael had kept hidden. Michael confessed to confronting Sarah, trying to scare her away from David, but he maintained that he had no part in her death. His words left the courtroom in stunned silence, and the tension between him and the prosecutor was palpable as she grilled him for deliberately manipulating the investigation. Michael's calm, measured responses did little to hide the guilt etched across his face, and the jury was left to grapple with whether his actions had contributed to Sarah's death, or if he was simply a desperate father protecting his son. After days of arguments and heated exchanges, the jury finally reached a verdict. When they returned to the courtroom, the room fell into an expectant hush. David, pale and visibly exhausted from the trial, sat rigid as the foreman stood. "We find the defendant, David Harper, not guilty." Relief washed over him, but it was short. The next verdict was directed at Michael. The court found him guilty of obstruction of justice for withholding key evidence and manipulating the investigation in an attempt to protect his son. David's father, the man who had dedicated his life to upholding the law, would now face the consequences of his actions. The aftermath of the trial left deep scars on the Harper family. David, though cleared of the charges, found himself alienated from those around him. The public, though they couldn't pin the murder on him, still viewed him with suspicion, whispering about his involvement whenever he passed by. Ethan, now more withdrawn than ever, carried the burden of the tragedy in silence. The emotional toll had fractured their relationship beyond repair, leaving David alone to grapple with the weight of guilt and loss. He had been acquitted in the eyes of the law, but the court of public opinion had already cast its judgment. As the dust settled, David and Ethan attempted to rebuild what little was left of their lives. Their once comfortable home, now a shell of its former self, stood as a reminder of everything they had lost. David, haunted by the consequences of secrets and lies, struggled to regain a sense of normalcy, though he knew deep down that nothing would ever be the same. The story of Sarah's death was not just a tale of murder. It was a cautionary reminder of how deceit and manipulation could tear a family apart. Michael, the father who had tried so desperately to protect his son, paid the ultimate price for his decisions, a symbol of how even well-intentioned lies could lead to ruin.